Welcome to the Oracle Mobile Application Framework YouTube channel. Now, in a previous episode you discovered that a mobile feature can be a collection of pages called a task flow. In this episode we'll dive into task flows to get a full picture of their power, and we'll dive into a few advanced features of task flows as well. So a task flow is simply a flow of pages and actions to implement a particular feature or use case. So in the case you can see on the screen, the green circled employees view is my start page in this task flow. From that page I can navigate to the emp graph page, the department page, or to the create emp. And you may notice that create emp is a slightly different icon. This isn't a page, but it's something called a method call. Now what's a method call? That means that rather than displaying a page, it will call a Java method to execute some functionality. So in this case it might be creating a new default employee row, and then it navigates to the next activity in the flow, which in this example is actually a call to another task flow. And we'll talk about task flow calls in a moment. The navigation arrows, called control flows, have names, and typically each navigation arrow would be assigned to something like a button on the calling page. So pressing a button hooked up to the show graph control flow will perform the navigation going to the emp graph page. And a button on that page hooked up to the finished control flow would navigate you back again. Finally, we have this element in the task flow, and this is called a task flow call. This means that instead of calling a method or displaying a single page, it will kick off another task flow, which itself could be many pages of flow, or it could even be calling other task flows. So let's drill into the add employees task flow. So here we can see it's a task flow with a single entry point and a number of different steps and then an exit point. Firstly, you can enter the employee's name and then enter some department information. Then we go to a new task flow activity called a router. Now a router lets us make a decision based on some condition. So if the new employee is, for example, a manager, we take this route and bring up a page to assign a team. Then we go back to the confirmation screen. The final element is something called a task flow return. You can have many different returns in a called task flow. Basically what this does is it tells the calling task flow which control flow case to follow when control has been passed back to it. And this is really useful because the calling task flow is directed on its next course of action based on what happened inside this called task flow. Now there are actually two types of task flow in Oracle MAF. There's something called a bounded task flow and there's an unbounded task flow. Now 99% of your work on task flows will be with bounded task flows, and the bounded task flow is simply a task flow with a single start point, and it may have 0, 1 or multiple possible exit points. And typically each feature in your application points to a bounded task flow. And a bounded task flow can be used as a subtask flow, so it can be called from within a bounded or an unbounded task flow to whatever depth you require. An unbounded task flow doesn't have a default start activity, so any view or page on the task flow could be called. And you'll get an empty unbounded task flow created in the ADFC mobile config.xml whenever you create your first AMX page. And whilst an unbounded task flow can call a bounded task flow, the reverse is not true. Now all that said, you probably won't find yourself using the unbounded task flow very much, so let's park it to one side for the moment. So let's take a look at the design time for task flows. You can create a task flow simply by selecting File, New from the JDeveloper IDE and then choose MAF Task Flow from the new gallery. Or as you see in the screenshot, it also appears in the menu if it's been previously selected. This gives you a blank, bounded task flow in which you can start developing the flow of an application or a feature. Now let's take a look in more detail at the various elements you might use within a task flow. So here is a task flow I created earlier, and let's take a look at each of these elements. Firstly, we have a view element, and a view element represents a page. So here I can see this particular task flow shows 4 different views or pages. I can create this by either dragging a view from the component palette on the right, or if you've developed the page already, you can directly drag that from the application navigator. Looking at the property palette, you can see the name of the view ID and the page that it points to. Now the names don't have to be the same, but they usually are. Now one neat feature here is that you can start building the flow of your application by dropping on these view placeholders, but you don't actually have to create the pages until later. And this allows you to get a good feel of the application flow and maybe even get buy-in from your end users before you start developing the actual page. And when it comes to developing the page, you can simply double click on the view element to create the page. The next element is very important, and this is called the control flow case. These are the paths that indicate how you navigate between pages or views. You can create a control flow by simply clicking on the control flow case in the component palette on the right and then draw a line between the 2 views. It really is as simple as that. And if you look at the property inspector, you will see from activity ID, which is the source of the navigation, and the to activity ID, which is the destination. Now the IDE updates these automatically as you draw or change any of the control flows. You can also select a visual effect of each transition as well. So if you want a transition between 2 views to be a fade or a flip, you can define it here. Now the next question you should be asking is, well, how do I actually trigger those control flows? Again, it's quite simple. Generally speaking, a control flow would be referenced by a button or similar command style of item. So in this example from the employees view page, there are potentially 3 navigation cases: add, show graph, and assign department. Now if we change and look at the source of the employees view page, you will see that a button has a property called action. And in the property inspector you can see there's a drop down list, and lo and behold, the 3 options add, show graph, and assign department are in the list. There's also a special case named __ back. Now the framework automatically provides a control flow which will take you back to the page you just came from. And this is a really neat feature as it saves you having to explicitly define a return control flow case, but it's also smart and it knows exactly where you came from, since you can arrive at a page from a number of different routes. You'll also see a control flow called home, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Now the next element is a task flow call. This represents your task flow calling another task flow. Just like a view activity, you can drag a task flow placeholder from the component palette on the right, or you can drag an existing task flow from the application navigator onto the task flow. You'll see that in the property inspector that the document property points to the task flow that's going to be called. In this case we're calling a static task flow, meaning the name of the task flow is hard-coded. However, as you become more experienced, you can set the task flow reference to dynamic, meaning the name of the task flow can be resolved at runtime. And this gives you massive flexibility to adapt what the user sees based on anything from their privileges, location, or even the type of device that they're using. You'll notice that there's a control flow called back coming from this task flow call. The task flow that is being called can pass back which control flow should be followed on returning from the task flow. And in this case there's only one, but there could be any number of returning control flows. The method call element allows you to call a Java method as part of your application flow. Now looking at the property inspector, you can see the name of the method which is being called. Now this looks rather cryptic, and you'll learn more about this later, but this is called expression language, or EL. All it is a way of referring to a method called createEmployee, which exists in a Java bean called myBean. The prefix of pageflowScope just indicates how long this Java bean will live in memory, in this case for the life of the page flow. The next property, fixedOutcome, indicates which control flow should be followed on completing the executing of the method, and in this case follow the doIt control flow. Next we have the router element, and this allows you to conditionally control where you navigate to next based on some expression which gets evaluated at runtime. So in this example, based on an expression, you can control if the flow goes through the update department control flow or it follows the back control flow. Looking at the property inspector, basically what you do is define an expression, and if that expression is true, which control flow case should be followed. Now the finer details of this expression language is something that will be covered later in this series, but it could be a call to a Java method or a reference to some value of data on a page. You can also define the default outcome which should be followed if none of the other cases evaluate to true. The Taskflow return is the way of indicating that this task flow has finished and control can pass back to the calling task flow. You could have any number of task flow returns depending if your task flow takes you through different paths, all of which require you to return to the calling task flow at the end of each possible path. So looking at the property inspector, we can see a property called outcome name. So this is the name of the control flow in the parent or the calling task flow that should be followed now that control is being passed back. The last task flow element we'll cover is called the wildcard. Now this is a neat feature that will save you a lot of effort. Imagine you've got a home button on each and every page in your task flow, which if pressed should immediately take you out of the current task flow back to the parent. Now this would involve having to define a control flow on every page pointing to the task flow return. Instead, you can use a wildcard. In this case, the wildcard ID is called asterisk. That means any view on this task flow can navigate directly to the task flow return. And if you look at the employees view page, you'll see that on the home button you have an action, and if you look at all the available actions in the property inspector, you'll see that home is one of the options. That means that any of these views on this task flow has the ability to navigate directly to this home return task flow via the use of the wildcard. And note that if I'd called the wildcard emp asterisk, then on the views, any views that started with EMP would be able to access the wildcard, and only those views that started with the letters EMP. The final feature of task flows we'll look at are called parameters. Now you might have noticed that in some ways a task flow is a little like a computer subroutine. It's a modularized piece of application function that can be easily called and reused. And just like a subroutine, a task flow can be parameterized. You define input parameters that the calling task flow should supply, and you can define return or output parameters to allow the call task flow to pass back information. So firstly, let's look at how you define the parameters on the task flow you want to call. If you look at the property palette for the task flow, you'll see I've defined one parameter called input parameter 1. This is the name of the parameter. There's then a field called value. Now beware, this isn't the value you want to pass in. In fact, this is the local memory in which the input parameter will be stored whilst being used within the call task flow. Generally speaking, the name will be the same as the parameter name, but prefixed with page flow scope to show that it will live in memory for the duration of the task flow. Similarly, you can define a return parameter. In this case I've defined a return parameter called return value 1. And this parameter will hold its value inside a page flow scope variable called return value 1. So within the called task flow, both these parameters are referenced by referring to page flow scope dot and then the parameter name. So that's the task flow being called. How about the task flow that's doing the calling? How does it supply values and how does it get its hands on the data being returned from the called task flow? So within the calling task flow, if you select the task flow call, you'll see in the property palette the two parameters I defined in the task flow that is being called. All I have to do is supply values. So for the input parameter, I'm passing in a static string using the expression language notation. And for the return value, I'm passing the value into an application scope bean, and my calling task flow can refer to that variable to read the value of the return value 1 parameter. So that's pretty much task flows in a nutshell. The Oracle MAF way of building application flow and navigation. Now make sure you master the basics of task flows since they're one of the key building blocks for Oracle MAF applications. So thank you very much for watching and make sure you check out the next episode in this series.